Do you know the origin of your ancestry as a black person? In other words, whether your ancestors were from America, living as original native Black American tribes, or did they come from Africa as a result of the transatlantic slave trade? Today, Black Americans are confused, and the government record prevailing system has left no stone unturned to ensure the confusion remains forever. If you ask your parents or grandparents, you might be told they are original Native Americans. But there are equal chances that you will be told that your roots lie in Africa. Which one should you believe, and which one are the real Black Americans? In this video, let's find out.
The Black History Archives.
To really decide who will be the real Black Americans, we first have to understand what makes original Native Black Americans and African Americans what they really are today. Not only that, but we have to know the major groups Black people claim to belong to really understand their identity. First, let's know who are Black Native Americans. Today, they are individuals of mixed African and Native American ancestry, often tracing their lineage back to indigenous tribes like the Cherokee, Choctaw, and Seminole. Interestingly, many Black Native Americans lived as free individuals long before slavery became institutionalized in the U.S., setting them apart from African Americans. These communities played significant roles as warriors, land defenders, and protectors of their tribal sovereignty. Their unique position in history allowed them to create a rich blend of African and Native traditions, forming distinct identities that reflected both cultures. A notable example of this is the Seminole tribe, which offered refuge to runaway slaves during the era of slavery in the U.S. These escaped individuals, known as Black Seminoles, became part of the tribe, living freely, intermarrying, and contributing to the tribe's governance and survival. The relationship between Black people and Native Americans in these communities was built on mutual cooperation and defense, rather than one of domination or servitude. But it gets interesting. That's because the Native Black Americans are themselves believed to have come from Africa. This becomes a strong argument due to the out-of-Africa theory, which suggests all humans came from Africa and migrated to different regions. However, for the sake of further explanation, let's consider the period of American colonization where Native Black people in America and those from Africa were quite different. That's when we have to know about the Black people who call themselves African Americans. They are descendants of Africans forcibly brought to America during the transatlantic slave trade. This group's history is deeply rooted in the forced migration, enslavement, and exploitation of millions of Africans. Their identity has been shaped by a continuous struggle for freedom, civil rights, and the development of a unique culture that blends African heritage with American experiences. What fundamentally distinguishes African Americans from Black Native Americans is their direct connection to the legacy of slavery and the systemic oppression that followed. Slavery stripped African Americans of their cultural and familial ties to Africa, erasing much of their heritage. Therefore, the term African American was adopted by Black communities to acknowledge both their American identity and their African roots, as highlighted by scholars. This label became a way to embrace their cultural heritage while also recognizing their complex history in the U.S. However, the landscape of Black identity in America has evolved, especially since the 1960s. Immigration has brought a growing number of Black people from Africa, the Caribbean, and Europe, who may not necessarily identify as African American. These first and second generation immigrants often maintain strong connections to their cultural heritage, such as being Jamaican or Nigerian, but also align with the broader Black experience in America. Darian LaBeach, a Jamaican-born Black man raised in the U.S., exemplifies this complexity. He describes his identity as fluid, with his Blackness being the constant thread that ties together the different aspects of who he is. For many, the term Black is more inclusive and recognizes the global diversity of the Black diaspora. However, to understand the difference between the two groups further, we have to look at their cultures. Black Native Americans have a unique and rich cultural heritage that is deeply rooted in their tribal origins. Unlike African Americans, whose identity has evolved through a blend of African and American influences, Black Native Americans have preserved many of their indigenous customs, languages, and religious practices. These traditions, which have been passed down through generations, set them apart from African traditions and reflect the long-standing history of Native American life in North America. Here's a reminder to please support us so we can make more videos for you by subscribing to our channel and giving the video a like. We want to build a strong community, and we need your support. Let's continue now. In many Black Native American communities, tribal ceremonies, spiritual practices, and governance structures remain intact. For example, tribes like the Seminole, Cherokee, and Choctaw have long-held rituals that honor the land, ancestors, and spiritual beings. Black members of these tribes have often participated in and led these ceremonies, merging their African roots with Native customs. Food is another area where this cultural blend is apparent, with traditional indigenous ingredients like corn, beans, and squash being combined with African-inspired flavors and cooking techniques. Language is a key component in maintaining tribal identity among Black Native Americans. Many have preserved elements of their ancestral languages, passing them down through their families, which distinguishes them from African Americans whose languages were largely erased during slavery. Additionally, Black Native Americans often played important roles in tribal governance, making decisions about land use, trade, and diplomacy. Some even held spiritual leadership positions, serving as healers or religious figures, further solidifying their place within tribal communities. On the other hand, African Americans have developed a cultural identity shaped by survival, resilience, and the fight against systemic racism. Over centuries, African Americans have created a culture that draws from both African traditions and American experiences, leading to the birth of iconic elements like jazz, soul food, and African-inspired spiritual practices. African American culture is also deeply knotted with political activism, particularly in the fight for civil rights. The civil rights movement of the 20th century, led by figures like Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, and Rosa Parks, was a defining moment in American history. This legacy of activism continues today with movements like Black Lives Matter, further connecting African American identity to the ongoing struggle for equality and justice. However, both Black Native Americans and African Americans do have a shared experience. Despite their different cultural backgrounds, both Black Native Americans and African Americans have faced systemic racism and exclusion throughout U.S. history. Black Native Americans, because of their African ancestry, were often marginalized within their own tribes and faced additional discrimination from the broader society. Laws and social norms frequently stripped Black Native Americans of their tribal identity, excluding them from land ownership and participation in tribal governance. This created a complex struggle where they were seen as outsiders by the white society. African Americans, meanwhile, faced the horrors of slavery and the brutal oppression of segregation. Even after emancipation, African Americans continued to experience systemic racism through Jim Crow laws, which enforced racial segregation and limited their access to education, housing, and voting rights. Both groups have had to endure being treated as second-class citizens, with their humanity often questioned solely because of their race. But something else happened, which further faded the line of difference between the two groups. The Great Migration, which occurred from the early 1900s to the 1970s, saw millions of African Americans leaving the rural South for urban areas in the North and West, driven by the search for better economic opportunities and an escape from the oppressive Jim Crow laws. This massive movement significantly contributed to the blending of identities between Black Native Americans and African Americans, as these communities often settled in the same neighborhoods, forging new social and cultural bonds. During this time, the line between Black Native Americans and African Americans began to blur. Many African Americans claimed Indigenous ancestry through oral history or family connections, though proving these ties was often challenging due to the loss or destruction of records. The erasure of documents, particularly during the forced removal of native tribes and the period of slavery, made tracing one's lineage difficult. Despite these barriers, cultural mixing was inevitable, as African and Native American traditions merged in areas like music, storytelling, and spiritual practices. However, people still had questions about their true ancestry, and that's when DNA testing became popular. Companies like Ancestry and 23andMe offer individuals the opportunity to trace their genetic heritage, and many African Americans have discovered Native American markers in their DNA. This discovery has fueled a desire to reconnect with native roots, explore tribal affiliations, and reclaim parts of their lost identity. However, DNA tests have limitations. That's because a person having a native Black American great-grandfather or grandfather may not have Native American genes. This is due to the random division of chromosomes. As a result, there is the possibility that the part of the chromosome that has Native American genes in your parents might not be selected when an egg or sperm is produced. What's more, there is a limited genetic record of the native Black Americans in the database. Therefore, even if a person has Native American genes, they are often ignored or considered African. So, after knowing this, what does it mean to be a real Black American? Well, the truth is, Black identity in America is anything but singular. It is a rich, diverse, and multifaceted experience shaped by African, Indigenous, and other cultural influences. For some, being a real Black American means embracing their African heritage and the struggles of the African American experience. For others, it may mean reclaiming native roots and connecting with tribal customs and traditions. Therefore, the term real doesn't negate one experience over the other. Instead, it highlights the depth and complexity of Black American identity. Whether a person identifies more with their African lineage or their native ancestry, both are valid paths. Black American identity is an ongoing journey of self-discovery, honoring both the resilience of African Americans and the cultural legacy of Black Native Americans. It is this richness and diversity that make the Black American experience so unique and profound. What are your thoughts on your ancestry? Were your ancestors the original native Black Americans or Africans who came as a result of the transatlantic slave trade? In the comment section right below, share your thoughts on whether most Black Americans today are Native Americans or African Americans. Would you like us to make more videos? If yes, please support us by subscribing to the Black History Archives and clicking the bell icon. You can check out more videos on our channel too.